All right, good morning, everyone. The Dorset Gardens Trust thought we were going to have a very quiet, peaceful time with the Repton anniversary year. We only have two rather indifferent sites in Dorset. Merley, where there was a red book, which has disappeared and is now top to bottom with mobile homes and caravan sites. And Stafford House, which appeared in fragments, but the work was only partly carried out in the mid-19th century. However, we were woken up when this extract was turned up in the Huntingdon Library in Pasadena, and it refers to a letter from Claude Scott to William Repton, who was Humphrey's son who looked after his business matters. And he refers to a semi-professional visit to Lytchett in Dorset above Poole, and there were a few drawings supplied. And this was to be offset against the cost of a loan which Scott had made to Repton. Scott was a very interesting man. Not only was he the personal banker to the Repton family, but he was a good friend of theirs. He was a very wealthy corn merchant turned banker, and in 1796 he purchased Sandridge Park, for which the Repton Red Book is here at the moment. You can look at it. And Scott accepted the advice offered to the previous owner of Sandridge Park to resite the house on the other side of the valley, and got Nash to build the house. Scott and his son Samuel, who later lived at Sandridge Park, were keen members of the Horticultural Society of London, and we know that Scott Sr. was in correspondence with Joseph Banks about possible tree planting work. Scott was also a great collector of books, and at his death, the sale of books took 5 days. And in the library, he had 4 of the Repton books. He had Chambers's Directory and Vesuvius Britannica and numerous other interesting books. I suspect from this he was a client that Repton was very keen to pursue. In 1810, Scott acquired this house, which is high above the Poole Bay. It was he bought it because his wife had very bad health, and they thought it would be very healthy living there. But it was also a very fashionable area, and there were a lot of villas being built there. Merley was 5 miles away, Stafford House was 10 miles away, and though not a villa, Encombe House, the home of the heiress who eloped with George Stanley Repton, had been brought up, and that was 15 miles to the south. I don't know if that's a possible connection in any way. This house was built by John Jeffrey in 1770 on a wedge piece of land of 14 acres, which he paid £825 for. And he commissioned Michael Searles, who was a quite well-known architect who had a practice in East London. And notably, he designed the Paragon at Blackheath, and he designed this little villa. Jeffreys lived a rather opulent life, and he ended up in debt to his fellow MP, Claude Scott, and he ended up being shipped out to Lisbon, where he was given a paid post as consul, and he had to tenant the house. This was the house which Scott bought as a process of the bad debt. And he was going to buy it as a holiday home, but instead he put his considerable energy and wealth into purchasing a lot of freeholds and local farms. And he set about asset stripping the neighbourhood. And he also did this in North Dorset and in Suffolk too. However, I've put this estate plan in because I don't think it's actually a very true representation of what was happening in 1825, because Repton had visited in 1812, and I'm sure there's an awful lot more going on by then. Scott himself died in 1830, and I was very fortunate in finding the sale particulars for the estate when it was to be sold. And on the left, you have the 5-bay original Sans Souci, and to the right, you have the new east wing, which was quite a surprise to find. And then I later found this view of the West Wing, which is of a later date. It was welcoming the soldiers home from the Second Boer War. But it shows what a really large house Scott had built. And one of the later owners said, airily says it was titivated by Wyatt, but nothing more I could find out about that. The thing which will be really of interest to you is this. The Searles particulars mention the words, the house was described as being the elegant modern mansion of South Lytchett House and surrounding 484 acres. The house had been modernised and improved at considerable expense and was now in the most perfect state of substantial and ornamental repair. But this is the much more interesting piece. The Searles particulars mention a passage leading to a hot and cold bath and dressing room. The pleasure grounds and flower gardens were laid out with taste and intersected with shady gravelled paths and a conservatory. Now, looking at this, it's sad it's not a much better plan or drawing, but you can see numerous flower beds on the east front of the house. The walled garden, which is now moved up to the north of the site, has got only three walls on it, and I've been told that that's a very typical Repton characteristic. And also, in fact, down in Dorset, it would be so mild there that you wouldn't have needed to keep much frost out. The Dorset County Council tree survey of the site says that quite a lot of the trees on the south front would date back to Jeffreys. It's a very fine plane and some cedar trees. And then there are a few more trees, ornamental trees, put in on the cottage walk to the east. I've walked the land and I can find no trace of any sort of ha-ha or sunken fence, so I imagine there was just a fence dividing the garden from the parkland. But the most interesting thing of all, perhaps, is if you look down to the southern boundary of the wedge of cheese, you'll see the new lodge. This was also built prior to 1830, and it links to the new turnpike road, which was put in. And as you can see, it's a very typical Repton access where the drive swept off the road without having to give you a right-handed turn. You then proceeded across the park where you would have had good views down to the sea, and then up the avenue which Scott had planted to the front of the house on the west side. Can you now remember the features on it? You've got the curved walkway, which leads to what I'm fairly certain is the hot and cold bathhouse, and then the conservatory. The conservatory has been pulled down. In fact, for a long time there was doubts if it was ever even built. So I've put in a photograph of the Belton Conservatory. One of my bits of luck was I managed to make contact with a charming lady who had been brought up in the house in the 20s and 30s, and her memory isn't that good. But when I showed her this photograph, she said, this is just like the one she was brought up with, and it brought a tear to her eye to see it. So that was rather nice. I then went back this summer, and I found that the Camellia House had been built, and we found a date stone of 1820 underneath it. And unfortunately been pulled down and been turned into a sixth form common room for the school, which had later taken up residence. I've just put in two rather jokey photographs just to show you that the conservatory really did exist to the right of the house. And this is when it was used as a school in the 30s. And then you've also got a picture of the bathing bells inside the Wartville Camellia House, but I thought that might be of interest to people who are Camellia House devotees. The covered walkway, which I drew your attention to earlier, of course is no longer there, but I took my new best friend photographs of the covered walkway at Ashridge and the one at Woburn. This, and my friend decided that the Woburn one, designed by Henry Holland, was a dead ringer for the one at Sans Souci. So that was rather satisfactory. The Ashridge Walkway had a lot of camellias around it, and likewise there were still camellias growing along the site of this one at Sans Souci. This, I've been very stuck on the hot and cold bathhouse, and I hope perhaps someone here will be able to give me some more information. I took this to my new best friend, and she said, no, it certainly wasn't like this. It was a much more rugged edifice, perhaps 20 foot tall, and it had a lot of alpines growing on top of it. The rockery, or whatever it was still standing in 1950s, and it was used for nativity plays, and we've got films of it. And my final Reptonish connection is the lodge. You see the one on the left, which is now marooned in the middle of the park. And I thought there were similarities to the one at Kenwood, so I've put them in side by side for you to look at. After this, I'm afraid it is completely downhill for Sans Souci. The estate was finally sold in 1832, and it was bought by the Fryer family from Wimborne, who mainly just tenanted it or left it empty. And there was certainly very little improvements or work done on the gardens there. However, in 1890, Sir Eliot Lees, an MP and cloth manufacturer from Oldham, bought the house and the major part of the estate, and he got W D Caroe in to improve the house. You can still see the central bays of the original Sans Souci in the middle. And to make it worse, this is actually built in a bright yellow ochre hamstone, which is rather in your face. And we have a view of the front entrance there. And then, to make you even more depressed, this is what the school has now done to the site. At the bottom left corner, you can see the original house. But if you look very carefully, just to the north of it, you can see the curved wall, which was the Camellia walk beside the Walkway. And that's now been incorporated into the school dining room. There are obviously so many questions still to be answered, and I'm hoping that people here will be able to fill me in on some of the gaps and may come up across some references to this. But we must remember that there was no red book. It was only a semi-professional visit, and it was the retirement summer home of a very elderly couple. If anyone is going to find any references to it, you should be warned that it is also known as Lytchett House, South Lytchett House, South Lytchett Manor, or Lytchett Minster School. Thank you.